if he were going to invade France from the beginning the way the Kaiser was under the Schlieffen Plan. The Kaiser never built a West Wall, but Hitler did, because it was his Maginot Line as he moved eastward. So all of these things, when he went to Paris, he went to the Pyrenees and asked permission of Franco to march across Spain to take Gibraltar. Franco said no, and Hitler ground his teeth and left. I mean, this is not a world conqueror.
Well, now, the major consequences of this war are that America inherited almost all of the empires in the world except what the Soviets got, and turned our country from a republic to an empire. And as you describe, I forget the numbers of millions of people who were then turned over to communist slavery.
Well, yeah, what happened was that, what did Britain say? Churchill wanted to go to war for Czechoslovakia. That wound up in the hands of Stalin. They did go to war for Poland. Poland was torn to pieces, millions of Jews and Christians murdered. Poland was torn to pieces and wound up in Stalin's slave quarters. The Red Army was in Berlin. The Red Army was in Prague. The Red Army was in Vienna. Russian armies had never gotten that far west ever before. All of China, for which America went to war, that fell to Chinese communists who murdered probably 10 times as many people as the Japanese had. The Japanese were kicked out of Korea and Vietnam and China, and the United States had to fight in Korea and Vietnam and contain China. And the United States inherited the remnants of the British Empire. The dominions like Australia and Canada turned to the United States for leadership, and the British basically transferred their empire to the United States of America, and they had failed to keep a single hostile power from dominating Europe. So I think they failed all the way around, the British did. I mean, I'm not saying they weren't heroic, but it's a question I ask is, were their statesmen wise when in 1914 Britain was mistress of the greatest empire the world had ever seen and a navy unlike any the world had ever seen, and 25 years later, Great Britain's living off American food stamps.
Now, what about the lessons of Munich? Because what we learned is that when people are evil, you have to start a war against them right now before they conquer the world.
The truth was that I'm going to be writing this in September, which will get me in some trouble. The truth is there was nothing Chamberlain could do. Look, by 1938, what was the situation? 3.5 million Germans in 1919 had been put under Czech rule of 7 million Czechs. They didn't want to be put under that rule. They were denied the right of self-determination. They had never been under a Czech regime before. They were very favored people in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They had a wonderful industrial economy, and they were simply put under Czech rule because the Czechs had been faithful allies in World War I to the West, and because Beneš and Masaryk, the Czech leaders, were great favorites at Paris. I mean, Wilson was gaga over Masaryk. What a great hero he was, George Washington, and all that. So here these Germans were put under Czech rule, and by 1938, they were agitating to return to German rule. They had been put there wrongly. They wanted to exercise their right of self-determination. The British had no alliance with Czechoslovakia. So will somebody explain to me why the British should go to war with Germany, a war to the death, in order to keep 3 million Germans under a Czech rule they had never asked for and that had been imposed upon them against their will? I mean, why should people go to war for that? And the truth is, the British couldn't win the war. They couldn't even fight it. They had no draft. They could not put a single division into France. They didn't have any to put into France. They had no Hurricanes and no Spitfires. The Americans said, if you go to war, we won't even sell France the planes that have already been ordered and paid for, because that would violate the Neutrality Act. The Canadians and Australians and Indians and South Africans would not have supported the British. And so they would declare a war they could not win for a cause in which they did not believe. Now, that's what all the people say that they should have stood up to the Nazis at Munich or asking them to do. And that's an absurdity. Now, where Chamberlain's blunder was, he comes home after this humiliating acceptance of Nazi terms that the Sudeten Germans, everywhere they're 50% or 51%, that goes to Germany. And so after accepting that, he comes home and says, it's peace for our time, and he's hailed as the great, the savior, the Prince of Peace. And Hitler's seething because he had wanted to walk in there, march in there. He hated Beneš. He'd wanted to march in. But so he comes home, and then he says, I'm the only guy that can deal with Hitler, and he keeps praising this agreement. And Churchill said the agreement stinks. And so, but, Churchill wanted war, but even John Lukács said it would have been a war, insane war, because the British would have lost it. So, but then when Hitler walks into Czechoslovakia, into Prague, as we discussed 6 months later, then Chamberlain suddenly reversed. He's humiliated. And so then the decisions are set in train that set off the Second World War that destroyed Britain. Everybody was going to be saved. The British, the Germans, the Poles, and the Czechs all were smashed and destroyed, and the Soviets wound up with Europe all the way to the Elbe River.
Could it be that part of the reason you wrote this book was to try to demolish that lessons of Munich myth and perhaps inject into the discussion from now on the lessons of making promises that you can't keep and entangling alliances with states that you can't protect without endangering your own interests, et cetera?
Exactly. What I've said is every nation, you got to draw a red line around what is vital, and you have to let other nations know what that is. But if you keep handing out war guarantees in an imperial fashion, willy-nilly, to nations or parts of nations that are not in your vital interest and you can't guarantee, you're inviting what happened twice in Europe. And this is just what the United States is foolishly doing today. I mean, there's talk today of giving a war guarantee to Georgia, which has a dispute with two of its breakaway provinces, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And the Russians are meddling there, and it used to be, good heavens, understandably, Georgia used to be is the birthplace of Stalin and Beria, so they have some connection with it. But we're loving, and the Americans just sent 1,000 troops in there. They're helping to train the Georgians. Now, you have a war break out there. There are many people, McCain included, who want to bring Georgia into NATO. There's a December meeting of NATO on which they're going to try to put Georgia and Ukraine on a fast track. That is a fast track to war. It is an act of insanity. Ukraine, God bless them, they're free and independent. I never thought it would happen. As for Georgia, I never believed it would happen. And it happened. And that's a wonderful thing. But we cannot lay down a marker that we're going to go to war with a nuclear power to ensure that situation endures forever.
Well, in the press this morning, Agence France Press is reporting that Russia is considering putting bombers in Cuba, or putting a refueling base for bombers in Cuba, quote, in response to America putting anti-missile missiles in Poland.
I've got a column I wrote, it'll come out tomorrow for Friday, which says, look, you know what the Poles are doing now, God bless them, Mr. Tusk, the Prime Minister, he says, we'll let you put in 10 anti-missile missiles on Polish soil, but you got to provide hundreds of millions of dollars for an air defense for Poland. We are being held up for the privilege of defending Poland. I would tell the Poles, we've changed our mind. We're not going to put the missiles into Poland. We're not going to put the radars into Czechoslovakia. We're going to restore our relations with Mr. Putin's and Mr. Medvedev's Russia. So, no, we don't accept this shakedown. Goodbye and good luck. And that's what I would do. I would never, frankly, we should never have given the NATO war guarantees to the Baltic states. We can't defend those countries. If a Russian militarist regime came to power and overnight they walked into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, what in heaven's name would we do? Does anybody think the Germans or the French or the Italians or the Spanish, all members of NATO, are going to declare war on Russia, a nuclear-armed nation? Anybody think the Brits will? This is, to me, this country's following the same stupid pattern of every other people before it, and it is, and you can see what the Brits did. Everybody said what a wonderful man Churchill was. Look at what he wound up with. He wound up with the empire in ruins as an island dependency of the United States about 3 decades after he entered the First Lord of the Admiralty of the greatest naval power and world power in history.
Well, let's hope it doesn't take a world war to get us to give up our empire.
Well, it will be gone if there's a world war, that's for sure. And but the United States is already. There are people pushing for war on Iran and a third front. It's good to see that there are people in the administration like Gates and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs who are trying to talk that down and damp that down. But you got the neocons are just livid over the fact that some second-level State Department guy showed up at talks with the Iranians. So, Scott, there's a lot of folks, I mean, the only lesson you learn from history is that you do not learn from history.
Yeah, that seems to be the way it is. All right, I got one more question for you real quick, Pat, before I let you go. Where do you read your foreign policy news?
Where do I read my foreign policy news? Oh, antiwar.com.
I was going to see if I could trick you into saying that. Thanks a lot.
Well, no, I just got up and I read it this morning. I'm down here at the beach. It's after Drudge, and it's I would say after Drudge and looking up how my book's doing on Amazon.com. It's the very next site.
All right. Hey, thanks a lot for your time today. Everybody, Pat Buchanan, he is the author of Where the Right Went Wrong, Day of Reckoning, A Republic Not an Empire, The Death of the West, and the new one, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, How Britain Lost Its Empire and the West Lost the World. Thanks very much for your time today.
Well, thank you, Scott.